Back to the second half of Session 12 of Pirate Smugglers and the Making of the Modern World. In this second half today, we're going to look at the drug trade, the issue of controlled substances. We've looked at this to some degree through the course. We looked at, of course, the issue of opium in China. We talked last time about the U.S. and its growing involvement with drug control, particularly after 1898 with the occupation of the Philippines and the issue of opium, the U.S.'s effort even early in the 20th century to establish some type of international structure for controlling these substances such as heroin, opium, etc. And of course we've seen another earlier experiment, shall we say, in controlled substances, and that has to do, of course, with prohibition of alcohol in the United States back during the 1920s and early 1930s. Today what we're going to look at is how does U.S. drug policy evolve in the last quarter of the 20th century, and of course how do the smugglers, the drug traders, respond to that effort to impose additional controls and to interdict the supplies of these drugs, and what drugs in particular are involved, and what are the economics of the trade. Not the moral right or wrong, but basically what economics drive it. Just as we've looked at other smuggled goods and said, well, when you have a high tariff, when you have a monopoly, that's going to encourage smuggling. Other factors like free zones will facilitate it. Well, in some ways, we're looking at the drug trade in a similar fashion. What are the factors that facilitate it, that make it profitable, and make it difficult to interdict or control? Now, in the 1970s, the sort of drug craze, if you will, was marijuana. This was the era, and really we could trace this back into the 1960s as well. This was the era of the youth culture in the United States, youth rebellion, the anti-war movement, and connected to that was widespread use, particularly among younger people, of marijuana. So this became the drug issue of the 1970s, was this widespread use of marijuana and deep-seated conflicts over how dangerous the use of marijuana actually was. What's clear is that because of its widespread use and seeming acceptance among young people, the U.S. government used this issue as a means of launching its war on drugs. The creation of the DEA in 1973, the Drug Enforcement Agency. Of course, the DEA was simply a reconfigured version of the earlier anti-drug bureaus that had been created all the way back at the time of Prohibition. So it's not really new, but it's a reconfiguration, in part to try to establish the fact that this is serious business. The U.S. government is committed to cracking down on the movement of drugs. It's clear that with this effort, we see repeated the same kinds of efforts in terms of drug control that had been attempted in the 1950s and 60s and all the way back into the 1920s and 30s. And that is, the main emphasis is on interdiction, on stopping the trade, either at the border or before sales are made, or arresting those people who are making sales of controlled substances, rather than on the issue, it's a supply issue, if we want to, again, talk in economic terms, as opposed to a demand issue. The main emphasis in the U.S. government is not to try to get people to stop smoking marijuana or taking other drugs, although there are always some efforts in that regard, publicity campaigns, etc., advertising. But most of the money, most of the effort goes into the other side, interdiction. Try to keep these substances out of the country, and if you can't do that, then use police powers for widespread arrests of those people who are marketing, selling, and to some degree, people who are just using these drugs. That is what gives birth to what was known as Operation Intercept in the 1970s, which was intended specifically for the purpose of stopping the movement of drugs. It's also at this time that the nation of Colombia starts to take a major role in the U.S. drug trade. Up until now, when we've been looking at things like heroin and even to some degree marijuana, but we were talking about supplies coming from Turkey through Marseille and other cities in France, and then to the United States. Some degree of opium coming from Mexico along with marijuana. These were the places that we normally associated with the drug trade. Now Colombia is going to emerge as a major supplier, in part because it does become a supplier of marijuana, but of course the critical issue is that it becomes a key location for the shipment of cocaine into the United States. This happens in light of a significant drop in heroin traffic. Why heroin decreased in significance was because it really acquired the reputation of being a loser drug, as I mentioned last time, that heroin addicts, as depicted in films but also in anti-drug advertising, are seen as people who have totally lost control of their lives. They're totally in control of this drug. They are living in the most base of conditions. These are the kinds of images that don't make drug taking look very smart, very sophisticated. Most people are not going to consciously choose to engage in the kind of behavior that would lead to that end for them, to that kind of behavior that they see portrayed in terms of heroin addicts. People unable to hold jobs, take care of themselves in the most rudimentary fashion. When you see those effects, heroin was falling out of favor, shall we say, with people who might be inclined to use controlled substances. But in its place, we do get a surge in the use of cocaine. Again, cocaine had long been used in the United States. It had the reputation, because of its price, as a rich man's drug, because the average person probably couldn't afford it, and certainly not to use it on a regular basis. At the same time, it did not have the sedative effects of heroin, so people could imagine themselves as using cocaine but still being able to hold down a job. And in fact, as I mentioned last time, studies show that at least for rudimentary tasks, like playing a simple video game, there isn't any impairment, apparently, in those basic neurological functions. That doesn't speak to more complex intellectual functions, but at least you can tell yourself, well, I can take this and yet I can get up and go to work tomorrow. I'm not going to have a major hangover. I'm not going to be sedated like a heroin addict where I can't function anymore. So these kinds of factors tended to give a certain sophisticated air to the use of cocaine. Now, use in the United States, consumption in the United States, and these are estimates, of course, because, again, smugglers don't write this all down in official reports, but roughly it was believed about 25 tons were brought into the country in 1978. By 1984, it's 137 tons, so you've had a huge increase, more than a five-fold increase, in the import of cocaine during these years, clearly surpassing anything in terms of the heroin trade. Actually, what is happening in this period is that a serious oversupply is developing. South American growers are producing far more coca leaves than can possibly be consumed as part of this trade. And these statistics here demonstrate that. And here, when we're talking about, if you look at these figures and then look back at the figures I just gave you, say, wait a minute, 1 minute you're talking 137 tons, and now you're talking 157,000 tons. The difference is these latter statistics refer to coca leaves, not the refined product. Okay, this is what's actually being grown, produced in Colombia at this time in terms of the raw product, the coca leaf coming off the plant. And here we see an enormous increase in the production of this product from 157,000 tons in 1985 to 235,000 tons by 1990. So in the Andean region, in countries like Bolivia and Peru, there is an enormous increase in output of this product, meaning that for probably the first time, there is a large supply of fairly high-quality coca leaves and cocaine available. The importance of that is that that large supply of high-quality cocaine made possible the introduction of crack cocaine. I use the date of 1985 because that is the period in which it was recognized as a major problem in the United States. One thing about crack cocaine is that many early users and even some drug officials thought that crack cocaine represented a highly refined version of cocaine, but it doesn't actually. It's not an issue of purity, and rather it is a smokable version of cocaine. Something you can put in a pipe and smoke rather than ingesting in other ways. That was the key to crack cocaine, and the fact that you could sell it in quantities that were relatively useful but extremely cheap. In other words, a single vial with a few grains or rocks of cocaine would sell for $3. So it suddenly became a very inexpensive product to gain access to by buying one of these vials. So this is the significance of crack cocaine, rather than the idea that it is some hyper-refined version of cocaine. It's simply that it's highly accessible to people. You don't have to be sticking it, you don't have to snort it up your nose or, stick it in your arm. All you have to do is smoke it, and it's pretty cheap. These factors helped vastly increase the use of cocaine in the United States. And as a result, this country witnessed a political and media frenzy in the 1980s. Politicians were denouncing the spread of crack cocaine. Images were constantly being portrayed in the news of people, especially in poor neighborhoods and ghettos and inner cities, using this, selling it on the street, and promoting the idea that the use of crack cocaine was closely related to violent crime. So all of this was seen as an enormous scourge. If heroin in the past could be recognized as having extremely negative impacts upon people's lives, nevertheless, the reality was that for most heroin users, it was a self-destructive behavior, and one that was limited to a very small part of the population. We're talking about tens of thousands of people who might be heroin users. Now you were talking about cocaine users who might number in the millions, and the constant refrain that crack cocaine was directly related to acts of violence in society, that violent crime statistics were rising, and it was assumed there was not just a correlation, but a direct causal connection between crack cocaine use and rising crime statistics. Whether that's true or not is another matter, but that was certainly the perception. In 1986, we get the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which was designed to funnel new resources into the fight against drugs, and particularly crack cocaine. 70% of the funds were to go to law enforcement. So we see that this pattern continues in the 1980s. The emphasis is on interdiction, to stop it at the border, or if not there, then to arrest the people who are trading in these drugs in the United States and put them in jail. The main emphasis is not on encouraging people either not to take drugs or to abandon drug use. Rather, it's an attempt to stop the trade itself. In 1989, President George Bush and his Defense Secretary Dick Cheney militarized the effort to fight the drug trade. They literally want to make it into a war on drugs. What they were doing were bringing in elements of the military to assist in the interdiction of drugs, and especially cocaine. The Coast Guard, for example, the Air Force was to be used as well to try to control the skies and control the oceans to prevent the massive smuggling of cocaine into the United States. At the same time, the U.S. encouraged and helped fund a crackdown in Colombia itself. The U.S. government made a strong connection between guerrilla movements, leftist guerrilla movements in Colombia that were attempting to overthrow the government by armed struggle, and the drug dealers who were trading in cocaine and selling it in the United States. Now, the reality is that by far and away, as the Central Intelligence Agency demonstrated, most of the money going to the guerrilla organizations was coming from kidnappings. They would kidnap local Colombians with some substantial resources and ransom them back. But, of course, for the United States, it was far more effective to argue that this is a dual threat, that we have these guerrillas who are trying to overthrow the government, and they are funding themselves through the use or the sale of cocaine by facilitating the growth of coca leaves and their export to the United States. This was a justification for the United States to go in and try to shape Colombian drug policy, get the Colombian government to crack down on these groups, to try to end the trade and to try to largely defeat the guerrilla groups that were supporting the growers in the countryside. Another effort in this militarization of the drug trade was the invasion of Panama by the Bush administration to remove its dictator, Manuel Noriega. It had a number of motivations, but one of the motivations was that Panama was indeed a major stopping point for drug traffickers who were moving their product from the Andean region through Colombia and then stopping in Panama, because the Panamanian government essentially made a deal, and that was, as long as you pay a fee, you can come in with a boat or a plane loaded with drugs, and then you're going to take off and move it up, to Central America, or to Mexico, eventually to the U.S. But while you're here, you don't have a problem as long as you pay this sort of tariff, this unofficial tariff, this fee that's required in order for you to move the drugs through this country. And of course, Panama was also a major source of laundering of drug money, as we've already seen, because of its free zone. These factors help encourage the Bush administration to invade and topple the government in Panama as another way of striking a blow at the drug trade itself. Now, the Clinton administration would take a slightly different tack. They would move more towards trying to reduce demand. Now, when you look at the shift in money, 62% for interdiction, 38% for prevention, it's not that big a shift. I mean, it's not like a huge amount of money, but they were moving in the direction of putting more into prevention programs and less into interdiction, largely because they were discovering, as virtually everyone who has ever tried to control smuggling of any kind discovers, that if there is strong demand and there are a ready source of suppliers, you can perhaps interdict 10% of smuggled goods, whatever we're talking about in terms of the type of good. With drugs, of course, you have this market of people who are addicted in the United States, so you have this intense demand, and then you have the growers and the traffickers in Latin America in relatively close proximity to the United States, and of course, as we will see, the economics work very much in their favor. So the fact is, interdiction at best captures maybe 10% of the trade, sometimes less. But if you look over a series of years, you may get lucky and get 20% in a year, but rarely will you ever get, on average, more than 10% of what's being smuggled. And as we will see, that's going to have minimal impact upon the suppliers because of some of the economic realities of the drug trade. Now, spending on the drug war between 1986 and 1995 was some $76 billion. So we can appreciate just how great an effort went in to this war on drugs, as it was called, from the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s. There was an enormous expenditure of resources to try largely to halt the flow of drugs into this country. Now, if we look at statistics on use, it appears that the drug war was successful. The number of cocaine users is estimated in the United States at 9.8 million in 1985 and dropping to 3.7 million by 1995. In other words, in a decade, you get more than a 50% reduction in the number of people who are using cocaine. That certainly seems like a success story. However, the question is, were they stopping use because interdiction was working? And the fact is, the economic data say no, that's not what was happening. Price tells the story. A price per kilo for cocaine. In 1975, it was $50,000. By 1995, it was $10,000 to $36,000. So, again, you have an enormous drop, 20, 30, 40% or more in the price of cocaine over several decades, including the time when these interdiction efforts are at their height. If the interdiction efforts are working, the price should be going up. It should be becoming more costly to buy this product because you're nabbing so much of it. The fact is, they weren't grabbing that much of the drugs that were being shipped into this country. And as we will see, even if they had been able to be more successful, to double their rate of interdiction, it probably wouldn't have had much effect either. Why did the usage go down? In large part, for the same reason that heroin use decreased. Now, of course, studies are still partial. We don't have all the answers here. But a major factor was that, like heroin, crack cocaine in particular, started to get a bad reputation. It was identified with people who were poor, people who are depicted as being violent, and therefore more and more people who might use or were occasional users begin to disassociate themselves from this product. A major factor for especially casual users, and many cocaine users were casual users, in other words, they weren't highly addicted, they did not use it constantly, is this question of image. Much like cigarette smoking. Do you see this as something that's cool, that's sophisticated to do, or do you see it as a loser's behavior, something that you don't want to associate yourself with? And that is an important factor. Not that other factors didn't help, and certainly just education about the potential dangers helped, but one of the largest factors was people more and more started seeing this, particularly young people began seeing this as something that they did not want to be associated with because it was not cool. It was not like smoking marijuana in the 70s that it made you part of the 70s generation, made you part of the youth culture of that time. Instead, unlike those sort of positive images that are associated with marijuana, very negative images have come to be associated with the use of cocaine, helping in the process of decreasing the number of users. But as far as interdiction went, interdiction was unable to do what it was intended to do, which was either shut off the flow to some significant degree, or at the very least, interdict a sufficient part of the flow to cause the price to rise, just like the Canadian government putting high taxes on cigarettes, caused the price to double, triple, quadruple, and just force people not to use it because it was just too expensive. That didn't happen. Now we want to look at the other side. We've looked at, well, what is the government trying to do to stop this, and how successful is it? What about the drug traffickers? What did they look like, and what are the economics of their business in terms of what are the profits, how do you make a profit in the drug business? Now, one of the things we have to look at here is it depends on what controlled substance we're talking about. For example, with marijuana, there are certain places that are the major producers, Colombia, Mexico, and the United States. The problem with marijuana for drug traffickers is its sheer bulk and a relatively low price, but particularly bulk. It's hard to smuggle large quantities. It's like smuggling bales of hay. Just the sheer size of it, it's not something you can stick in your bumper and hopefully get across the border. And largely for that reason, over time, domestic production in the United States has become the principal supplier of the U.S. market. People say, well, I don't believe that because, the stories I hear about Mexican marijuana and Colombian marijuana, sure. But the fact is, in the United States, we produce a third of the world's supply of marijuana. It's being done on small scales throughout much of the country. It's very difficult to control. It has appeared everywhere from West Virginia mining towns to, redwood forests in the far northwest of the United States. And these domestic producers who do it pretty much on a very small scale account for most of the domestic market. And why? Very simple. Because it is so hard to move large quantities of this across international borders. So for marijuana, the profits can be significant, but the real problem is that it's just very difficult to move without allowing the government to indeed succeed in a high level of interdiction, just because the product is so bulky. Cocaine has a different economics to it, and it is similar, very similar to cigarettes, in the sense that these are both low-value products. In other words, their actual value at the time that they are processed or manufactured is very low. Very little cost has gone into the manufacture of these products. But they are products whose price rises dramatically, in one case because of government taxes, cigarettes, and the other because of interdiction, and because you're raising the risk costs of moving this product into the markets where it's in demand. So both products are very similar in that regard, that they're very cheap to make. The significance of this, and relates to what I was talking about earlier in terms of attempts at interdiction, is that the cost of interdiction to the drug smuggler is very low. In other words, what he is going to lose when the DEA captures, a boatload or a plane load of cocaine is a very low cost to him, because the actual production costs are so low. Now, of course, there is the issue, well, but you have to pay people to transport it. True. But most of the transport system is a system that is, one, being leased, if you will. Now, planes, for example, you're going to pay somebody to deliver the product across the border, but you don't buy the plane. You buy the services of the pilot and the plane. And usually, most of the payment is going to come after the product is successfully delivered. So the risk is on the pilot and the plane, neither of which you own. You put people on international flights, you bought their ticket, yes, but they're not going to get paid for delivery of that product till they successfully get through customs. So if they get arrested, again, you haven't lost much. You don't have much capital tied up in the actual transit system itself, because you're largely leasing that, and it's on a risk basis that you lease. In other words, the risk is on the person transporting the goods. You lose very little if they get arrested, because it's a low-cost product to begin with. So another problem with interdiction, besides the fact that it usually only captures, maybe 10%, no more, of smuggled goods, is the fact that even when you capture the product, even if you can raise it to 20% that you're capturing, the cost to the drug trafficker is minimal. He is paying rock-bottom prices to peasants who grow the coca leaves in the Andean region, and then for processing, again, a relatively cheap chemical process to turn it into cocaine or crack cocaine. So the actual production costs are low, and most of the other costs in terms of transit are only going to be paid if the good is successfully delivered. So you're not doing very much damage to the drug trafficker, even when you manage to interdict a significant portion of his product as it goes into the market. This is the other reason, besides how much you can hope to interdict, that interdiction has such difficulties in shutting off the drug trade. As long as you have addicted consumers who want to demand this product, you've got this steady, intense demand within the United States, your cost in supplying that market is very low, even when some of the product is seized. Now, drug production in these countries has been periodically attacked, as the United States tried to do in Colombia and has tried in Peru and Bolivia, but efforts to wipe out production, usually involving, for example, the use of herbicides to spray plants, assisting local military in finding fields where the product is being grown and destroying it, have been minimally successful. I mean, it's clear when you look back at those statistics from 85 to 95, where the production of coca leaves is just exploding in the Andean region, because you're not just going after some criminal organization, as you are with the traffickers. Here you're attacking tens and hundreds of thousands of peasant families who have been involved in the growing of coca leaves for centuries. I mean, coca leaves were used in the Andean region long before the Spanish conquered the New World in the beginning of the 1500s. They were used for medicinal purposes. They're used in religious ceremonies. People commonly chew on the leaf today. It's a way of relieving hunger and also helping relieve effects from cold weather. And these people see the production of this product as central to their economy and to their society. In fact, decades ago, growers in Bolivia formed their own union, and they advertise and they present their side of this issue whenever the government engages in one of its drug elimination programs. they're organized and they campaign. They advertise their position, and they have the support, of course, of tens of thousands of other people like them who are doing the same kind of thing as a way of earning a living. Efforts to substitute other crops have not been highly successful because, while payment for coca leaves isn't very good, payment for other products is even lower. So getting people to raise other crops as cash crops has not been highly successful. So you're fighting more, in this case, in terms of production, than just a criminal organization. The criminal organization is there largely for the purpose of refining the product, but most of all for moving the product, financing its movement from the production point into the market in the United States. Therefore, the efforts to eradicate production in the Andean region have essentially been a failure. I mean, it's clear that this has not happened, that production has not decreased because of the attempts at eradication. And when eradication efforts become particularly intense, what happens is people begin moving. They move to other mountain valleys where they'll grow coca leaves again. They'll move across borders into places like Ecuador and begin growing. So this part of the process is extremely difficult to control. It involves both domestic political considerations within these countries, like Colombia and Peru and Bolivia, but it also involves hundreds of thousands of citizens in their countries whose economic livelihood depends on production of the coca leaf. The drug distribution organizations, on the other hand, they are criminal organizations, and they tend to be highly centralized, and it is these groups in particular that the United States has sought to go after. It is easier to go after them than, of course, to go after hundreds of thousands of peasants and their communities who are the source of the original product. Probably the most famous of these drug organizations in South America is the Medellin cartel. The Medellin cartel really began with shipment of marijuana back in the 1970s. They had become involved in the growing and shipment, but mostly the shipment of marijuana from Colombia, which was considered by the drug culture of the time to be outstanding, high-quality marijuana, often referred to as Colombian gold. And this is where the cartel got its start, was in handling such shipments. But of course, we've already looked at the economies here in terms of the bulkiness of marijuana. You can make a profit, but interdiction is much easier with that kind of bulk product than it is with something like cocaine. Now, the cartel was focused on a group of brothers, the Ochoa brothers, Jorge, Juan, and Fabio. They were part of a relatively well-off ranching family. I mean, they weren't really rich, but they were certainly doing better than just getting by in terms of this ranching enterprise, but they decided that they were going to branch out and look for even more profitable enterprise than ranching. One of their principal allies was a man named Pablo Escobar. And Pablo Escobar, unlike the Ochoa brothers, who were legitimate until they decided to get involved in drug smuggling, Pablo Escobar was a street criminal, and was a petty criminal who became associated with the brothers, was particularly helpful in terms of enforcement, the use of violence against competitors, etc. And the Ochoa brothers shift by the 1980s into the direct shipment of cocaine into the United States. Prices were better. The product is much less bulky than marijuana, much better way of making a profit. You can ship a lot more and make a lot more money. The routes that they used were routes that dated back to the days of the heroin trade, when Cubans and Puerto Ricans and others were shipping product through the Caribbean and into Miami. Basically the same routes and connections I used to ship the product from the northern shores of Colombia up through the Caribbean, sometimes hops and skipping over different islands, landing at different islands at various times, places like Trinidad and the Dominican Republic, etc. have had problems in this regard, that they were being used as major points, stopping points along the drug route running from Colombia up into Miami. Now, one question that's always asked is, why did Colombia become such a focal point of the drug trade? What are the characteristics of this country that allowed this to happen? Well, There are two basic ones. One, we've already seen in terms of allowing smuggling and piracy to explode during the late 20th century, and that is a weakened state. Colombia's government and Colombian society had been the focal point of political violence, extreme political violence, on several occasions during the past century. At the turn of the century, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a war between liberal and conservative factions called the War of a Thousand Days, which took an enormous toll in terms of violence within the population and deaths as a result of that war. Another, even more violent event, counting tens of thousands of dead and its victims, was what was called the La Violencia, or the violence that took place in Colombia during the 1940s and 50s, times when tactics like the necktie cut were being used, and that was where opponents, when they captured someone from the opposite side, would slit their throat and then pull the person's tongue down through the slit in their throat to form a sort of necktie. This kind of gruesome activity gives you some idea of the level of violence that had shaken society at this point. Eventually, the liberals and conservatives came to a compromise where they would essentially swap control of the government. Each national election would lead to, somehow, the election of first a conservative and then the next time around a liberal, and so forth and so on. Unfortunately, what that meant was that degree of compromise also meant that there was not a lot of activity by a viable opposition, in the sense that why bother attacking the other side and politically when you know you're going to win the next election anyways. If you're out of power now, you'll be in power next time. It's the way the game is played. As a result, there's not a lot of control on the government. Government corruption ran rampant, and this kind of weakened authority system and bureaucracy was the system that was facing the growth of the drug trade in the 1970s and 80s. Hardly surprising that something like drug trafficking would flourish in Colombia at this time, given the limited ability of the state to enforce laws within its national borders. The other factor is Colombia's geography. Colombia has an extremely diverse geography. Jungles, mountains, the country is extremely difficult to traverse because of these vast differences between tropical forests and mountains that run throughout the countryside. What that means is that for the government to engage in massive sweeps through the countryside to attack, for example, the leftist guerrillas or to attack drug traffickers, is very difficult to do because of the extremely uneven geography. So both of these factors combine to facilitate the rise of the, as they're known in Spanish, the narcotraficantes, or the drug traders of the 1970s and 80s. Both of these factors contribute to their growing power, and as we will see, once the ball is rolling and they start accumulating money, then that money is yet another means by which they can distort the political process and ensure themselves of a safe operating environment. Indeed, Pablo Escobar was the member of the Medellin cartel who planned a program of buying influence within the government. The whole idea was to work their way up throughout the ranks of the government, through the police, the military, the judiciary, even to the executive branch, to buy off government officials so that the cartel could operate with relative impunity within the country. And this began a long process of deep-seated corruption within Colombia, of politicians and jurists being paid off by the drug traffickers, so that no matter how well-intentioned a law may be, the chance of it being actively and vigorously enforced against the drug traffickers was almost zero. Now, this relationship underwent a significant change as the momentum built up in the late 80s in the United States for this war on drugs, as Americans became increasingly convinced that crack cocaine was this great scourge that threatened social stability in this country. As a result of that, the U.S. government was pressuring Colombia not only to try to enforce its own laws and use its own military to interdict the trade, but to allow the U.S. to extradite drug traffickers for trial in the United States, given the fact that it was unlikely they'd ever be arrested, much less convicted for their crimes in Colombia. The United States was pressing the government, and the government was agreeing to allow extradition to take place. At this point, Escobar turned on the government and said, well, if they're going to try that, they're going to pay a price. We've been paying them off for a number of years now. If they're going to turn around and extradite us to the United States, where we know we'll be convicted and never see the outside of a federal prison again, then we're going to attack the government. And in fact, by the late 1980s, Escobar and the cartel were waging war against the government, assassinating political candidates, political figures, jurists. No one was really safe from the cartel if it was believed that they were cooperating in any way with drug enforcement policies. So Escobar swings radically from a policy designed to buy influence to pay off government figures to waging war against the government, planting bombs, arranging assassinations, because the government has agreed to allow the extradition of drug traffickers from Colombia to the United States. In the early 1980s, or 1990s really, I'm sorry, the Ochoa brothers decide that they're going to surrender. Now, their surrender was one of the great comical events in judicial history, because essentially what was going to happen is they were going to be put in jail, but jails that would consist of essentially their ranches being surrounded by troops where they'd be allowed to do pretty much what they wanted. They were not going to be treated as common criminals by any stretch of the imagination. However, as they slipped from the scene, at least into semi-imprisonment, if we can call it that, the problem became what was happening to Pablo Escobar. They were sort of playing, Where's Waldo? The DEA was now playing Where's Pablo, trying to find him so that they could arrest him and then extradite him to the United States for trial. Finally, in 1994, based on a tip, the DEA says it was because of tapping phone conversations, the Colombian military and police were able to move in, find Pablo Escobar's hiding place at the time, and he died in a gun battle with the authorities. Now, as best as anyone can now tell in the aftermath of this, Escobar's location was pointed out not as a result of phone taps by the government, but as a result of information provided by a competing group, the Cali cartel. It was the Cali cartel, another city in Colombia, that turned over the information as to where Pablo Escobar could be found. So they essentially used the Colombian government and the U.S. efforts to track down Pablo Escobar as a way of eliminating some of the competition. Now, the Cali cartel is headed by, again, a group of brothers known as the Rodriguez Orihuela brothers. It operates in a somewhat different manner than the Medellin cartel had done. The Cali cartel, unlike Pablo Escobar's efforts, tried to maintain a low profile. They did not become part of Pablo's war against the government because they felt that was simply would attract too much attention, would make it easier for the United States to justify further assistance to Colombia and even possibly intervention. They preferred to stay or maintain a lower profile. They were less, let's say, flamboyant than Pablo and the Ochoa brothers were. But they were nonetheless as deeply involved as the Medellin cartel in drug smuggling. And of course, they took over a good deal of the Medellin cartel's business when Pablo Escobar was killed, and with the Ochoa brothers at least technically in prison, although they were still pretty much running things even from their semi-imprisonment. Nevertheless, they did lose a significant amount of business, and the Cali cartel was able to pick that up. They did follow similar policies to Pablo Escobar in terms of his early efforts to buy politicians. They were very much involved in that same process of paying off government figures. In fact, it was claimed, at least, although it hasn't been proven, accusations that the president during the 1990s, Ernesto Samper, had his campaign for president paid for by the Cali cartel. Though, again, can you prove that? It's pretty difficult to prove when you're dealing with drug trafficking groups. They're not exactly going to leave their account books out for you to examine. Now, the cartel did respond to U.S. interdiction efforts. During the late 1980s, President Bush had made a major effort, as we've seen, to militarize the interdiction process. There was a great deal of focus on Miami and the Florida Panhandle, I should say Florida as a whole, because, of course, that was the major entry point for cocaine coming from Colombia. But typically, these interdiction efforts that focus on a particular area are pretty much the equivalent of punching a pillow. In other words, once a huge number of Coast Guard vessels were assigned in Florida to be interdicting vessels, they had Coast Guard planes flying to spot the drug ships as they sailed up from the Colombian coast or from Caribbean islands. The more attention that was focused on Florida, and Miami in particular, the more the Cali cartel moved its operations, particularly to Mexico. Now, Mexico isn't the only place. In your readings, you'll see a piece on drug smuggling that talks about drug smuggling in New England. And in fact, that was one of the other places the smugglers went by the late 1980s, early 1990s. If the U.S. is going to put a vice grip on Florida and raise the interdiction level, no problem. You know, the United States has thousands of miles of coastline, and of course, in areas like New England, you have a craggy coastline where almost every mile or so along the coast is a place where you can bring small boats in and do it in some areas, such as Maine, in relative isolation. In other words, there are not going to be a lot of people around to see what you're doing. So here was a wonderful opportunity. Now, of course, you've got to sail further. It raises your risk in terms of having to move the product a greater distance before you can get it into the country. But nevertheless, there are any number of opportunities along that coast to bring drugs in. Mexico, however, did become the major stopping point and transit point for drugs into the United States, partly because Mexico, again, has a border that's thousands of miles long. Mexico has a border which is marked largely, not exclusively, by desert areas. In other words, relatively desolate areas where people can move across the border and not be easily spotted. And of course, it also allows for the use of, the drug air fleet. You can fly hundreds of planes, small planes, over the border. Again, they're very hard to spot and certainly very hard to control if there are large numbers of them, because you've got a fairly desolate area, an area that's difficult to patrol. And as we will see, the drug trade is going to have some of the same effects on Mexico's politics that it did on Colombia. As you begin corrupting officials, that means it's going to be easier to operate within the country. When members of the police, the military, and the judiciary are being paid off by drug traffickers, the efforts at enforcement are going to diminish in Mexico, making it a haven for people who want to use it as a transit point for smuggling cocaine into the United States. One such group involved in this process was the Juarez cartel. Just as Colombia develops these cartels, these drug smuggling organizations, so too Mexico, given the size of the trade, is going to generate similar kinds of criminal organizations. The Juarez cartel was headed by this man, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, and it was the major cartel for drug movement during this time, particularly starting in the late 1980s. The major targets for movement of drugs into the United States at this time were Houston, Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York City. Part of this can be explained by transportation, that you've got excellent transportation routes, trains, superhighways connecting from the Mexican border to LA, to Houston, and to Chicago. The other factor is these are all large cities with major populations that would be involved in drug use and they have excellent communication networks with the rest of the country, so you can move the product from these 4 primary locations into lesser markets that surround them. So all of those factors, New York would be the one place where you can't really say that transportation is the best, but it's an enormous metropolis, and of course has ready communications with virtually all of the eastern part of the country, so it's another logical place to go. These were the main targets for bringing the drugs across into the United States to ship them to these 4 urban centers. By the late 1980s and early 90s, 70% of the cocaine coming into the country is coming from Mexico. So we can see just how important Mexico has become in the cocaine trade. And again, part because of the corruption that occurs among government officials as drug profits explode, and we'll see just how large the revenues are that are being generated here later on. Partly because of the size of those revenues, officials are going to be corrupted, and then you've got this very long border. You've got a lot of desolate areas where you can move the product, or it's very hard to set up constant patrols and interdict. In 1997, Amado Carrillo Fuentes decided that things were getting a bit hot. The U.S. government was pressuring for his arrest, and Mexican officials were indeed searching for him, so he decided to undergo plastic surgery, only he died as a result of a botched facelift, I guess we could call it. In fact, for a while, the DEA was unwilling to believe that this could actually have happened, that this, drug kingpin actually died because some plastic surgeon didn't know what he was doing. But in fact, it was proven with fingerprints and blood tests that indeed it was Amado who died on this operating table, trying to make himself less recognizable. However, not to be discouraged, his brother Vicente immediately took over command of the Juarez cartel, and they hardly missed a beat in terms of the continuing promotion of the drug trade between Mexico and the United States. Now, the Juarez cartel has also sought to avoid, during the 1990s, as much as possible, the kind of drug wars that were taking a huge toll in life in Mexico. Because the Juarez cartel was the largest, but one of many criminal organizations involved in the trade. And not surprisingly, they had taken to killing one another as they competed for turf, competed for business. However, over the years, particularly under Vicente, the cartel has sought to operate what's called the Gulf Cartel, which is a loose alliance of the various drug smuggling cartels in Mexico, trying to negotiate solutions rather than see problems resolved through violence. Now, again, they never succeed entirely in doing this, and they're always small fry who are getting killed, but generally they've managed to reduce the amount of infighting among the criminal organizations, much like the U.S. criminal organizations in the past, in the 1950s, trying to achieve a degree of coordination with their efforts and minimize violence that results from competition. Now, by the mid-90s, the Rodriguez-Orihuela brothers are in prison, but as I said, the fact is their prisons are not exactly the most airtight institutions. And indeed, the Cali cartel has gone on playing a large role in drug smuggling, just about as big a role as it ever did. So the imprisonment of these figures in Colombia has meant very little in terms of the actual interdiction of the drug trade out of Colombia itself. The cartel is involved in manufacturing the product, particularly crack cocaine, in other words, refining it down to that substance, to distribution and wholesaling of the product. So they are a complex corporate organization, if you want. You can compare them to certain types of multinational corporations. They have their limits in that regard, but in some ways they operate much like a multinational corporation in terms of their manufacturing and distribution of a product internationally. Part of that rationality, if you will, of these enterprises, in other words, the fact that they do function as rational corporate enterprises, is operating on economies of scale. In other words, being able to get vast amounts of product in keeping prices down to their customers despite the risk factor by being able to ship large amounts. That means using larger planes. It means packing trains, automobiles, trucks, ships, and even a few years ago, the fact that the Cali cartel was found to be building a submarine to move product. Now, the submarine was only partially assembled at the time it was seized, but it gives you an idea that these people are definitely into the development of major transportation facilities to help them move large amounts of the product. But the submarine is kind of an exceptional experiment because, of course, as we've seen, almost all of these other transportation facilities are leased out by the cartel, again, to minimize their risk. Another area where they have sort of replicated some of the activities of multinational corporations is in information technology. The cartel is as interested in advanced computer networks and communication facilities as any multinational corporation. In fact, the cartel is known to have, or was known to have, a large IBM mainframe computer. The purpose was to collect information on the phone numbers of drug agents, whether DEA, Colombian, Mexican, etc. This information allowed the cartel to regularly tap these phones and, most importantly, to trace phone numbers recorded as calling the agents. So they could track back with their system and find out who was calling almost any drug agent in Colombia and almost any drug agent in Mexico. The importance of that is it helped them uncover people who were leaking information, selling information to the drug enforcement agents. It helped them to crack down on moles, people who were turncoats within their own organization and were selling information to the DEA and to local drug enforcement officials. So the information technology is highly useful in establishing and maintaining security for the drug cartel. There also have been fairly advanced purchases of encryption technology, so they themselves can communicate through cell phones, etc., using encryption technology and hopefully avoid the tapping of their phones, the securing of information by the DEA and other sources, because they are able to maintain up-to-date encryption technology that more often than not can frustrate the attempts of government officials and government agents to tap into this type of communication. So IT is both important in getting a line on those who may be subverting the organization, selling it out to drug agents, and also in protecting the security of their own communications, which of course are vitally important for the accurate and speedy movement of products and sale of products internationally. These types of multinationals, if we want to call them that, of course benefit from the same kinds of conditions that benefit smugglers in general. Weakened states, Colombia and Mexico, both weakened. Colombia had problems to begin with in terms of the political system and its effectiveness in governing the nation. Both countries have suffered from increased corruption because of the huge amount of drug money available. And of course, we see this in the United States as well, that government officials and government agents have been bought off by drug smugglers. The problem is far more widespread and rampant in other countries, but it happens here as well. So the combination of weakened states and political corruption, particularly fueled by large amounts of drug money, really facilitate the operation of the drug cartels as much as their use of technology and improved transportation equipment. Putting this all together in terms of what's happened over the last quarter century, in terms of the explosive growth in piracy and smuggling, and again, the seeming contradiction that we have lived through a quarter century or more of globalization, defined simply here as meaning the reduction in trade barriers, the creation of a more open international trading system, opening economies up to foreign investment. All of this has proceeded at a startlingly rapid pace through the last quarter of the 20th century. And yet, where that process, when it occurred in the 19th century, as we saw, helped decrease smuggling to a significant degree, here we see an explosion. So what we've tried to do today is look at what are the factors that contributed to making this new era of free trade one of the worst eras in terms of piracy and smuggling. What are the factors that are distinctive here that contribute to this explosion when economic logic would suggest that international trade policies should discourage smuggling, or should be discouraging smuggling, not encouraging it? Contributing factors. One vital factor, perhaps the most important in many ways, is the deepening and spreading of consumerism. That consumerism is no longer an idea, a behavior pattern that we find strictly among the upper class and perhaps the upper middle class in most countries in the world. Today, most people in the world are serious consumers. They may not be at quite the level of consumerist mania that sometimes grips this country, where everyone is seen to be playing a vital role in the national economy, because if you don't buy things and consume things, the economy will collapse, where people believe intensely, many of them, that the consumption of material goods will bring them ultimate human happiness. It may not be on that intense a level, but in fact, the vast majority of the world's population, unlike, let us say, a half century ago, is involved in consumer economies. That means that we have a vastly expanded market for products, consumer products, precisely the products which most countries in the world over the last quarter century, even though they were limiting trade barriers, the vast majority of these countries were still restricting to some significant degree the import of such consumer goods. In China, we looked at the example, 100% tariffs on the import of consumer durable goods. This is fairly common around the globe, that yes, there has been considerable lifting of restrictions, but very often consumer goods are still a target because many countries, certainly China is one of the leading ones, fully intend to industrialize into producing many of these products themselves. So they don't intend to allow simply a free flood of goods, even though they have lowered many tariffs. They have kept restrictions on consumer goods in many instances. So as a result, we have this ballooning demand in the last quarter of a century for consumer products, more and more people demanding things like Nike sneakers and Microsoft software, etc. And yet, many governments in the world, certainly most of the world's people, live in economies where the government still has significant restrictions on at least some consumer goods. So we still have ideal conditions for smuggling as long as these barriers still exist in some form, when their target is precisely those products that millions upon millions of people now are demanding as never before. That dual process of maintaining some consumer protectionism and the explosive growth of consumerism itself around the globe combine to help encourage smuggling. Another factor that we've seen is the weakening of state systems around the globe. Particularly, we mentioned Russia, the collapse of the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe. We saw the undermining of ideological fervor in China as China began to abandon some of the strictures, the economic strictures of communism, and turn to a somewhat freer market. Along the way, the ideological fervor which guided Chinese officials has largely dissipated, and as a result, we do see more corruption, more willingness to tolerate and even engage in things like the pirating of consumer goods. And of course, we're only talking about a portion of the world. If we look at Africa in the last 25 to 30 years, we see just how many of these countries the Congo would be a good example, have also had highly unstable or extremely corrupt state systems, which either find it difficult or simply will not engage in strict enforcement of their own tariffs or other trade control systems, and as a result become both markets for large amounts of consumer goods, or smuggled goods I should say, and become in many cases the source of smuggled products. And we looked at the Congo for one example. Another example that in part fits the same idea is Paraguay. Paraguay is not the only third world country that has used piracy as a way of stimulating its economy, as creating another type of industrial base. In this case, an industrial base based on the copying of software and other consumer products for sale to its neighbors. So here too we see not so much a weakened state, although the state is weak economically, but a state that's decided to solve that problem largely by condoning piracy of consumer goods. The new technologies that make it possible to duplicate products play a major role as well. And the fact is you can copy a CD or a DVD, or for that matter a complex software program, and the duplicate is identical to the original. At one time, of course, with films, etc., it could be argued that the copies were inferior. Now they're virtually identical. And therefore, it's difficult to try to combat a technology which produces identical copies of high-quality products and sells them for a great deal less. So this technology not only allows the rapid production of DVDs, etc., but also very high-quality duplicates that therefore are going to find an excellent market when the price is going to be significantly lower than the original. Another factor, which we've seen in the past and remains important today, particularly because of the increasing number of free zones that have been expanding significantly ever since the end of World War II. The free zones, of course, set up areas that are free of tariffs, free of trade controls, and very often, as in the case of Hong Kong, as in the case of Panama, these free zones are located right on the border of highly protected economies, meaning smugglers can use these areas to bring goods within a mile or two of the border of these highly protected economies, do it essentially duty-free, and know that there's going to be few questions asked either bringing those goods in or shipping them out, because of course the free zone depends on its own economic growth by not enforcing any tariffs and by not engaging in prolonged inspections of products that are being brought in or sent out of the free zone itself. To do so would slow up trade, slow up traffic, and therefore decrease business in the free zone. Therefore, these are ideal locations from which smugglers can operate. And as we've seen in the case of Hong Kong, that's been true for more than 100 years. In the case of Panama, it's been true for more than 50 years. The informal economy. We looked at, in close detail, at vendors in Mexico City, but a similar story can be told in much of the developing world in the latter part of the 20th century. We saw statistics where 20, 30, 40% or more of the workforce, 20, 30% of gross national product may be attributed to the informal economy. The key, as we saw in Mexico City, is the fact that for vendors in the informal sector to compete successfully with established department stores and merchants who can provide guarantees, who can provide financing, etc., to compete successfully, they have to be able to compete based on price alone. And that means they are the leading market for smuggled and pirated goods, which allow them to sell comparable products at a 40 to 50% discount compared to their formal competitors. So the informal sector and its explosive growth, and it has been growing substantially in the second half of the 20th century, means an explosive growth in demand for pirated and smuggled goods. And it provides the pirates and the smugglers with a readily accessible distribution and marketing system. As I pointed out during the lecture today, in this country, if you're dealing with pirated or smuggled goods, you try to set up a few small stores out of the way where hopefully the police won't notice. But in a third world country, you can walk along the main streets of the capital and usually find informal vendors who are dealing primarily in smuggled and pirated goods. And occasionally, yes, the police may harass them, but they really are not going to face any serious crackdown. It is widespread, and governments know that this is a vital source of employment for people in their economies. They are hardly going to crack down and destroy this source of employment, the source of business activity. So as a result, pirates and smugglers have a ready-made distribution and marketing network that they can use to unload their goods in these countries. So this is another inducement to piracy and smuggling. We also saw how multinational corporations can benefit from smuggling. We saw in the case of, for example, cigarette smuggling out of Hong Kong, helping to make a market in China. Even though the Chinese government has a cigarette monopoly, nevertheless, millions of Western cigarettes, including American cigarettes, enter China every year, helping to create a market because they encourage consumer demand. People identify with the trademark. They've seen the advertising. Now the product is actually available to them. So it helps to create a market for these companies in places where their product is effectively banned in terms of the official trade and tariff policies. We also saw in the case of Canada how Canada's effort to reduce the consumption of cigarettes by imposing extremely high taxes during the late 80s and early 90s led to an explosive growth in smuggling. In this case, cigarette companies in Canada exporting legally those cigarettes to the United States without having to pay the tax because they were not being consumed in Canada, and then those same cigarettes being smuggled back into Canada. So that the cigarette companies ultimately were able to see their market maintain its size because they didn't have to pay the tax. But at the same time, they could maintain, look, we weren't smuggling, we were simply legal exporting cigarettes to the United States. Once people in that country got a hold of them, we're not responsible for what they did with them. And then, of course, we've looked extensively at opportunities for drug smuggling from Latin America, particularly from Colombia. U.S. interdiction and the economies available to the smugglers, the fact that they can produce this product at very low cost, means that interdiction, even when it's somewhat successful, has very little economic impact on them, and that has helped create a thriving drug market in the United States. Add to that the fact that huge amounts of money are generated by the drug trade allows the drug dealers to corrupt government officials both there and in the United States. Mexican cartels, for example, generate $50 billion in U.S. currency on an annual basis. The oil industry of Mexico, its most important industry, its most important earner of foreign currency, generates a quarter of that. So you realize how massive the drug trade is in terms of the money it can generate, and therefore how massive the corruption can be, both in this country and overseas as a result of it. And of course, as I just mentioned, low-cost production, meaning that even when interdiction is successful, it has minimal impact upon the drug dealers because they have spent very little in producing that product and very little in actually having to transport it unless it's successfully shipped. Next week, we'll be looking at a summary of the past 12 weeks and a review of the second half of the course in preparation for the final exam. Until next week.